Octopath Traveler Zero is different from the other mainline entries in many ways, one of those coming in the form of how it handles its playable cast. This entry allows you to have a customizable character rather than allowing you to pick one of 8 travelers to start with. Because of that, the main character is allowed to choose between the 8 jobs to use themselves. However, the quality between each job greatly differs, which is why I'm here to go over all of them and discuss the best available options. Before I go straight into it, I do want to mention the criteria I'm working with. Most of the ranking and scaling is based on the earlier sections of the game, as that's when it's most crucial. Part of the rankings consider their utility and what they bring to a team. Because it's early game, there will be a limited selection of characters that can only fill so many roles. If a job can provide something unique or fill in a gap with your starting party, then it will be considered more favorably, even if it's having consistent damage across fights or solid coverage like early access to strong gear. This also includes their early passive skills, as the strength of those will equally affect their early game viability. That, or if it calls for it, the first passive skill and an unlockable action skill slot as an alternative. That's because XP, JP, and leaves will be a lot more limited early into the game, so it's safe to assume you'd be working under those circumstances. The best starting jobs in my mind can check many of these boxes. So with that out of the way, let's start with the first job in the Warrior. One thing I've yet to mention is that every job the main character has access to is unique in some way because of the different move pools and passive skills they have. The protagonist using the Warrior class will differ from other warriors in the game, including the first one you get access to in Viator. The protagonist's warrior job is a lot more offensive by nature, while Viator's warrior class is significantly more defensive. This means there's barely any overlap on that end, even if both can use swords and polearms, which is great as the job can fill a niche of its own. The warrior job is also one of the only 2 options available that could still keep access to Vacuum Slice, as it's only usable by characters with sword access. This is the mastery skill that you obtain during the prologue. There are multiple characters you get early into the game that could use swords as well in Viator and Kelsis, so it mostly becomes a matter of who needs the single target move more, but in this job's case it just becomes an additional option more than anything else. The warrior can already access Helm Cleaver, which is an incredibly cheap single target sword attack that also debuffs physical defense on the foe. This can be further combined with the warrior's innate abide to increase their own physical attack, allowing for great damage output when properly set up. The only caveat is that Helm Cleaver is immediately accessible in Theatropolis, which makes it less unique to the warrior really quickly. Even so, the warrior still has access to a lot of valuable combat skills. Spearhead is a single target polearm attack that lets you speed control while dealing damage, as it lets you act faster on the following turn. Counter Posture lets you play a bit defensively, as it grants the ability to counter all physical attacks for 2 turns. Assault can allow you to hit everybody with a polearm attack, and Upending Strike lets you strike twice with a sword for a lot more damage. There's a lot of solid moves that the warrior can choose from, and many of the added effects on those moves can make the warrior a lot more strategic and flexible. However, this is with the caveat that a lot of them cost over 30 SP to use. A couple of them are pretty cheap SP wise, which is incredibly good for long-term battles, but that would mean having to limit your usage on some of the stronger options. Not to mention the lack of multi-hit moves and coverage means it isn't really reliable for breaking enemies. You'll more than likely end up relying on other characters for that to get the most out of this job. Still, it could be worse, but it can become an issue really quickly if you aren't paying attention to your SP consumption. The warrior can also unlock peak performance and plus 50 attack as their first 2 passive skills, which plays into their offensive nature even more. Peak performance gives you more damage output when their HP is at full or more, and plus 50 physical attack is self-explanatory. These are 2 very good passive skills to have really early into the game, and overall, it's a pretty strong starting job. There are some clear weaknesses with SP thresholds and coverage, but you probably won't regret starting out with the job at least. Next, there's the Merchant class, and similarly to that of the other games, it's always been the job with the least amount of focus. Usually it has a mishmash of moves that try to do a bunch of things but never really excelled in any area. In a way, it could be classified as a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none job, but that's without mentioning hired help, which I'll get into a bit later. For now, Octopath Traveler Zero's Merchant finds itself in a similar position where it has access to a bunch of moves that all do radically different things, some of which aren't even that bad early in. The biggest claim to fame currently is that it has access to Arrow of Fortune, which is one of the faster ways of grinding JP in the game. It grants a lot of JP based on damage dealt with the move, and beyond getting lucky with Kate, it is one of the fastest methods of grinding JP. It does cost 35 SP to use every time, and when it's especially that early into the game, you'll constantly find yourself having to recover SP to keep it going consistently. Fortunately, the Merchant does come with Rest, which is a pretty great early game move since it's one of the stronger healing moves you can access. Granted, it is a self-targeting move, but it doesn't cost anything, and it can restore SP and remove status ailments on top of that. It's pretty self-sufficient on that end. Not to mention, the Merchant also has access to Donate BP, which is a pretty amazing support move. However, Donate BP is also on Stia, who is much more supportive by nature, making it not as amazing here, and she's the first character that you get access to besides the main character. If nothing else, the merchant does have access to Mystic Shot, which is an area of effect bow attack that restores SP to the front row based on 2% of the damage dealt. This can be really good in battles against several enemies since it just lets you recycle SP really easily. Because of that, the merchant is somewhat support leaning for a good while, even with its polearm moves since they're just single target attacks. Its first two passive skills include extra leaves and plus 50 physical defense, the former simply granting extra money after battles. Neither of these are that great, even if the extra money is convenient to have. They don't really allow the merchant to stand out more than it already does since it doesn't actively benefit any playstyle, but that lack of commitment to any role really does highlight the biggest issue with the merchant as a whole. There's no real focus on the merchant job since it prides itself on trying to do many things at once. This isn't helped by other characters overlapping with the merchant itself, meaning its flexibility isn't even nearly as valuable. The lack of focus means it can't really commit to any type of role that well, which is holding it back more than ever in this case. The main thing that carried the merchant job in the other two games was its access to hired help, which had a plethora of offensive tools to work with. In Zero, the merchant no longer has access to hired help, which does hinder it overall since it was the main way the job provided any semblance of offensive pressure. If you need something for damage output, then the merchant isn't going to help that much, especially since SP costs for its offensive moves, Deadly Thrust, Piercing Thrust, and Arrow of Fortune, are really expensive to use, and that's on top of having no access to multi-hit moves, further limiting its combat potential. At the very least, it does have access to polearms and bows, which isn't even that bad of a starting combination as your first bow user won't come until a bit later, but it's also not so much of a benefit that it's worth running just for that alone. The merchant overall is pretty gimmicky, but it does have access to an incredible passive skill. Once you unlock everything, it gains a passive that lets you use the back row's BP for moves, which is incredible. However, it requires so much JP to unlock that it's not even something that would ever come up early into the game. I don't think it's the absolute worst job to choose, but I wouldn't advise taking it as your starting job unless you really want to farm JP. And then there's the Thief, and it's generally been considered a really strong job across the first two games. Both provided decent support and had access to a lot of notable offensive moves, the latter of which changed drastically between both games. And in Octopath Zero, the Thief is more reminiscent to Octopath 1's Thief job because of the multiple multi-hit dagger moves that restore HP and SP. SP Thief in Octopath 1 was incredibly busted because it didn't cost much of anything to hit twice with a dagger, and you could basically restore all of your SP back afterward. That on top of some daggers that inflicted debuff effects, which meant it was more likely to apply on a foe. SP Thief did return, except it does cost a bit more SP to use. However, it's not that difficult to at least break even with the cost, which means that you can always have access to a free double attack while charging your BP. The damage modifier might have been changed, but one benefit to the early game is access to Befuddling Dagger. It's incredibly easy to obtain since it's right next to an early game loading zone, and it has a significant amount of attack on top of an accuracy debuffing effect. It's surprising that they even brought this back, and on top of that, the Thief has access to 2 additional multi-hit moves in Master of Shadows and Tri-Edge, the former hitting a foe with dark damage twice and the latter hitting a foe with daggers 3 times. All of the Thief's moves except for Tri-Edge are also incredibly cheap to use, all of which being single digit, barring Level Slash, which is 14 SP, but that's not really that much. Combative wise, the Thief is really fantastic since it's not only self-sufficient, but it has a lot of coverage between swords, daggers, and dark magic. The multi-hit moves also aren't random like Calcis's or other characters, which means damage output and shield poking will be consistent. The only move that's somewhat iffy is Level Slash, as it's simply an area of effect sword attack. It won't be a move that you clamor to over many of the other options it has access to. However, this issue can also be patched out. Similarly to the Warrior, it is one of the only starting jobs with access to swords, which means it can use Vacuum Slice. The difference, however, is that the Thief lacks a single target sword attack, which this move can fulfill almost immediately. Although, as mentioned in the Warrior section, you can also access Helm Cleaver incredibly early, which makes the slot choice a lot more competitive, but point being, you can get good sword attacks for the Thief, which is super convenient. The Thief in general is an incredibly flexible job, especially when taking its passive skills into account. The first 2 passive skills include Extended Enfeeblement and plus 50 Evasion. Extended Enfeeblement extends the duration of debuff effects inflicted by the character, which is really great as a first passive skill. Plus 50 Evasion is fine, but you could instead unlock an action Weaken skill slot and use Weaken Foundation instead, assuming you chose it as your starting skill. With the right action skills, not only can the Thief be really strong in combat, but can also provide solid support alongside it. The only caveat is that the Thief doesn't really have any debuffing moves innately besides Shadowbind, which only debuffs speed. I do think a decent portion of its strength does rely on outsourcing skills, both combatively and supportively, and that difference may become noticeable when trying to perform certain niches. But even without some skills, the Thief job is still arguably among the best starting options you have access to. Between the low SP cost, the multiple multi-hit moves that are self-sufficient, and our good coverage, the debuffing niche on top of what it can already do in combat, as well as the extra action skill to push it over the top, it genuinely does so much for one job. Overall, I believe the Thief should be absolutely considered when choosing your starting job. There's also the Apothecary, which got somewhat of a makeover. Something new to the Apothecary, as well as a couple other jobs in this game, is that now every job has access to multiple weapon types. Before, it only had access to axes, which did limit its coverage, but now it can also use tomes. In fact, every job in this game now has access to 2 weapon types, which is a really nice quality of life update in general. The Apothecary is a very support-leaning job, having access to several moves that buff allies and debuff foes. You have First Aid, which is perfectly fine since it's just a standard healing move. Its most standout move is definitely Heal All, as it grants AoE HP regeneration to the front or back rows for several turns. The amount it heals isn't a lot, but it is convenient to have a steady source of healing, especially if it means not having to use another action to restore HP to an ally. However, besides that, the Apothecary is lacking a lot. Its combative move pool is incredibly limited, only spanning Amputation and Crosscleave, which does overlap significantly as both are single target axe moves. One of them just hits harder but costs significantly more SP to use. But if there's one saving grace, it's that you can get access to a really strong axe in Theatropolis from the same person that also gives you Helm Cleaver. It's an amazing early game axe that also isn't terribly difficult to obtain, making it a very clutch addition to battles very early in. It won't make the Apothecary a combative juggernaut, but it does salvage it a bit. And despite the Apothecary being supported by nature, a lot of its moves are pretty slow or inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Besides what was already mentioned, it has access to Rehabilitate, which grants status ailment immunity to any target, and Shroud, which has a chance of inflicting blindness on a foe, and Vivify, which can revive an ally for 24 SP. Rehabilitate is okay, but it's probably not worthwhile in practice since you could use back row units to cover for them, and Shroud is pretty bad, and Vivify isn't the worst, but you could just use an Olive of Life at that point. There's really nothing in particular that stands out from the Apothecary's kit besides Heal All. This is also not including the first 2 passive skills the job has access to in Resist Ailments and plus 50 max SP. Resist Ailments makes you more likely to resist a bunch of status ailments, which is okay, but it can't carry the job on its own, especially since it's not even guaranteed to resist them. It could end up doing nothing in the end. This job really could have benefited from some more variety, as having 2 axe moves that function the same already limit its combat capabilities. You could always outsource a mastery skill that lets you hit twice with a tome, but it wouldn't make the Apothecary that much better anyway, since it means less supportive options. To me, this is undisputedly the worst starting job you could take. Its supportive moves are either really slow or inconsequential, its combative moves are limited in middling, and the passive skills are very lackluster. Not to mention you already have access to Stia and can get Macy immediately after the prologue, both of which provide way more utility. Stia has better axe moves and can donate BP and SP, and has some decent status support she could pass around. And Macy can inflict useful penalties, has access to share SP, and has access to a healing move that lets her immediately go to the back row after using. The Apothecary unfortunately doesn't do enough in my eyes to justify choosing it as a starter job, and I would advise avoiding it. Next, there's the Hunter class, and it's had a pretty rough history throughout the first 2 games. Before, where the Apothecary was pretty decent in the first 2 games, the Hunter was pretty mediocre the bad. However, in a twist of fate, it's the opposite, where the Hunter class in Octopath Zero is actually really good. The Hunter has a wide variety of moves that really let it stand out from every other starting job. For starters, there's so many multi-hit moves to choose from, which can lend itself well for breaking foes. Rain of Arrows randomly hits foes 5 to 8 times with a bow attack, which can be iffy against multiple foes, but shines incredibly well against single enemies. This can easily come up in boss fights. There's Stray Arrows and Boomerang Toss, both of which hit random foes 2 times, but also similarly shines against single targets. It's one of those situations where the floor could be really low, but the ceiling can be really high under the right circumstances. If you're fighting several enemies at once, the effectiveness of these moves are going to go down dramatically. But the Hunter still has single target options to work with. 2-tiered Shot is genuinely amazing, as it's effectively a 4-hit bow move that swaps you to the back row after using. It's pretty expensive at 30 SP, but it is offset by the fact that you are then moved to the back row where you can recover some SP, effectively reducing the cost of the move by a sizable portion. It can end up costing as much as Boomerang Toss down the line, while arguably having some of the highest damage output out of any move, which is really good. And as mentioned in the Apothecary section, you could get access to a really strong axe in Theatropolis from the same person that also gives you Helm Cleaver, except you could use it on a job with better combat options. Still, Boomerang Toss isn't exactly perfect, so it's worth considering outsourcing another axe move if you can, since every other damaging move the job has is bow, and one throwaway wind spell for some reason. That said, the Hunter also finds itself in a somewhat similar situation to the Thief, as it could also double down on a supportive niche. The Hunter has Ensnare as one of their moves, which causes the target foe to act last for several turns. This is a phenomenal move for turn control, and it will come up a lot more often than you think. This can similarly be combined with Weaken Foundation to further drive in the supportive niche. It won't last as long as the Thief using it, but Ensnare more than makes up for it utility-wise. On the topic, however, unfortunately the Hunter's best passive skills are unlocked way later. Its first two passive skills it gets includes extra experience and Invigorating Break. The former is pretty self-explanatory, and the latter restores HP when they break a foe, which isn't really that good. The main thing that the Hunter will have going for it is being able to double down on support thanks to the action skill slots. I think that's where you'll end up finding more success with the job, but even so, the Hunter's move pool is really solid for the most part. However, a lot of the moves really work out when fighting against a single enemy. Straight arrows, Boomerang Toss, and Rain of Arrows randomly targeting foes isn't exactly ideal if you're trying to deal with something specific. Not to mention the wind move the Hunter gets is incredibly lackluster, just being an AoE wind spell, which won't really do much in a lot of situations, but at least it's some coverage. A lot of these weaknesses are definitely workable, even if it just means playing a bit slow in the beginning. There will be so many instances where you end up fighting something by itself anyway, so it's not as bad as it may seem. And overall, the Hunter class is really strong and has some of the better support utility to work with early into the game. I believe it should absolutely be considered when choosing your starting job. There's also the Cleric, and similarly to the Apothecary, the job got updated to now have staves and fans. The addition of fans is something new to the Cleric, and it's just another means of covering weaknesses, so that's pretty nice. However, unlike the Apothecary, the Cleric actually has a valuable supportive niche they can work with. The big thing that the Cleric is going to provide is an area of effect healing move, which isn't something you even get for a decent while. There's a bunch of single target healing spells, but the Cleric coming with heal wounds means that you can constantly keep the front row or back row safe. This also works in tandem with the Cleric's first passive skill and HP recovery up, which raises the amount of HP restored by those types of skills. Both of those things combined will basically give you some of the best healing in the game by that point in time. The second passive skill grants plus 50 elemental defense, which also helps contribute to the healing as it scales off elemental defense. On top of that, the Cleric also has access to Wondrous Veil. Wondrous Veil allows an ally to revive with 25% of their HP after being incapacitated, which is incredibly convenient. Not having to spend an additional turn to get an ally up is really great, and they can be immediately patched up with heal wounds with that action instead. The Cleric job will be good at keeping characters healthy. However, that's about as much praise as I could give to the Cleric, as the rest of the move pool is really mediocre. Beyond the healing capabilities, the Cleric has access to a few combative moves, but they're not really that great. Those offenses are limited to Brain Bash, which is inconsequential, and two light spells that completely overlap with each other. One costs 11 SP to use and another costs 22 SP to use, but it hits slightly harder. It would have been a lot better if the second option hit 2 times instead for multi-hit purposes. Still, at least it's a source of light damage, which is only readily available on the Scholar that early in. Besides that, the buffs that the Cleric gives out are pretty bad, with Sacred Flame's protection granting a small chance to negate enemy attacks for 2 turns, and Celestial Veil giving an ally the ability to restore SP based on 3% of the damage they take from a foe. The former is entirely RNG and should not be relied on. The latter does next to nothing for most battles. You can restore more SP by being in the back row instead of relying on getting hurt by an enemy. You should just prioritize taking less damage instead. It might be best to use one of the action skill slots to provide extra support utility, since there's nothing else the Cleric can do well besides healing. But if nothing else, it is very strong healing. Overall, the Cleric isn't that amazing, but it does have a defined niche. Having that kind of healing capabilities early into the game is really great, but it can fall off once you get a dedicated healer. Still, it's definitely doing more than some other starting jobs, which is better than nothing. And then we have the Scholar, and this is probably the job that's changed the least between Octopath 1 and 0, barring the addition of tomes. Before, it only had access to staves, but now it has both tomes and staves. The Octopath 1 Scholar job more or less had the same move pool as the one here, except they changed some of the elements. Before, it was fire, ice, and lightning, but now it's fire, wind, and light, which is really convenient as one of the earliest recruitables covers both lightning and dark. This means you could cover 5 of the 6 elements right after the prologue, and all of the magic between both of them is area of effect magic, which means you'll be able to clear out a lot of random encounters with ease. The Scholar has 2 fire, wind, and light spells, where one is single cast and another is a double cast. Most enemies that early in won't be able to deal with multi-hit magic, which makes early game random encounter clearing pretty convenient. You can also increase its effectiveness once you get to Theatropolis, as you can contend a solid tome and then treat a decent staff in Alexia's recruitment area. Alexia, by the way, being the one that's going to be helping you with lightning and dark damage output. It's pretty easy to bolster up a Scholar, but it then becomes a question of who should get what, since you would technically have 2 Scholars to work with. It's not the biggest deal if you'd rather keep one of them for shield shaving, but even then it's not that hard to bolster magic damage that early in. Alexia herself can debuff elemental defense, which will go a long way for both of them, as well as one of the early game passive skills that the Scholar can have access to. The first 2 passive skills include Study Foe and plus 50 elemental attack, the former revealing a weak point from each foe in battle. This is definitely more of a battle convenience more than anything else, but at least there's the extra elemental attack to work with. You could always outsource an action skill slot for a magic typing you don't already have access to, but if you have Alexia in your party, you'll be able to cover every element except for ice anyway. That said, you can get ice magic from some NPCs, but it's not really that easy early in. If I remember correctly, the special edition of the game also gives out ice magic mastery to start out with, but I don't think it's worth considering that, as many people aren't going to be buying it. But even without ice, that kind of coverage is really good. The unfortunate downside is that it's not very good for long-term battles. The SP costs for the multi-hit magic spells are 33 SP each, which you will burn through incredibly quickly. You will still be able to use the single cast options, but it won't exactly fix the issue of SP consumption. Because it costs so much, you can't really rely on them all that often. They may end up being back row units that only pop out when they can freely expend some of their SP. At most, it will be helpful for shield poking since it's 5 elements of double casting, but that's really the extent of it because the Scholar job really can't do anything else since it's a purely offensive class. Analyze is technically there, but I don't really count that since it's just more of a convenience than anything else. What you see with the Scholar is what you'll get essentially, and as a result, the Scholar peaks really early as a job. The longevity of it is up in the air, but it will probably be incredibly useful from the get-go, which is why it is a strong starting job. Having access to amazing coverage and multi-hit area of effect magic is incredibly useful. And with Alexia covering 2 other elements, you effectively have everything but ice covered, which is incredible for the early game. Not to mention its magic damage that hits pretty hard, but because it's similar to the Octopath 1 Scholar, it's very likely that it falls off quicker than a lot of other jobs, and the SP costs are absolutely killer early game. Even so, you probably wouldn't regret starting out with this job. And for the last of the 8 starting jobs, you have the Dancer, which also has 2 weapon types now in fans and daggers. This is also the only job of the 8 with virtually no overlap, unlike many of the others that can be found on subsequent recruits. You may find that some of them have similar moves or weapon types that cut down on coverage, but the Dancer doesn't really have any of those issues. As mentioned in the earlier sections, support options are extremely limited early into the game that isn't a form of healing because of access to action skills and move pools. As a result, the Dancer ends up becoming the best available and the earliest source of stat support. It having access to 4 moves that can bolster stats during battle is really great to have this early into the game. The stats it can raise include physical attack, evasion, elemental attack, and elemental defense. The attack boosting moves will always be useful. Elemental defense will come up in battles, which makes it a nice choice as well. Evasion isn't awful per se, but I think it would have been a lot better if it was physical defense. Even so, having easy means of passing around bonuses that early in will be useful. The Dancer also has some okay offensive moves with Frosty Refrain, as well as 2 multi-hit fan moves in Wild Strike and Triple Arc. Wild Strike and Triple Arc do overlap too much though, as the former is a 2-hit fan attack and the latter is a 3-hit fan attack. I think it would have been different if the Dancer was a lot more of an offensive class where you could leverage on the damage more, but you won't really get that here. It's why it's more passable on other jobs. The lack of magic does sting a good bit too, since the job actually has a solid magic attack modifier to work with. It can be made up for with an action skill, especially since one of the the earlier ones you can obtain is a lightning move, but both moves only hit one time. Because of this, you may want to keep doubling down on support as it already excels in that role, especially because of the passive skills it gets early in. The first two passive skills include the show goes on and extra JP. The former extends the duration of buff effects granted by the character, which is pretty great. Extra JP is self-explanatory, and it's not even that bad to have around. It's not as fast as Arrow of Fortune for JP grinding, but you do have more tools to work with alongside it. If nothing else, the show goes on being the first passive skill might work out better, as you can use an action skill slot to either increase its support or offensive pressure. Unfortunately, it won't extend duration for skills such as Weaken Foundation, since it is a debuffing move, but even that's good to have alongside the dancer stuff. You could always bolster physical attack while debuffing a foe's physical attack and defense, which could also make up for the lack of physical defense boosting moves. But worst case scenario, throwing on another magic spell can still be helpful in some capacity, even if it's for shield poking. The dancer is a pretty straightforward support class, what with the plethora of buff moves and multi-hit fan attacks. It is a very passive playstyle compared to most other jobs here, but there's next to no overlap that early in, as you don't get access to a dancer that quickly. Because of that, it's very easy for it to stand out, even if it doesn't do anything so amazing. Just having a constant source of support is really nice that early into the game, making it one of the better starting choices. But with that, every single starting job has now been covered, and you're probably wondering which job is the best choice. I did talk about my personal feelings on every single job, but if I did have to rank them personally, this is how I would do it. The Hunter and Thief are arguably the strongest starting jobs to choose from. Both of them have access to amazing damaging moves that help break enemies, the Thief in particular being incredibly self-sufficient and having more multi-hit coverage, and the Hunter hitting a lot more often with its multi-hit moves. Both of them can also double down on support thanks to extended enfeeblement, and the Hunter's innate ensnare, which will be amazing for long-term battles. Between their amazing offensive move pool and supportive niches they can carve out, they'll end up contributing more than any other starting job. The Thief is definitely a lot more consistent, but the Hunter definitely has a higher ceiling for breaking purposes, so depending on which one you value more is the one I would probably choose between the two. After those, the Warrior and Scholar follow, both of which are pretty respectable jobs too. They both have access to a lot of solid damaging moves, which can make getting through some battles more of a breeze. However, they are very straightforward damage dealing jobs that don't really contribute anything else besides damage. They also have very clear weaknesses in their kits, but it shouldn't hinder them that much. If you could just find a good source of SP recovery, then it should be fine in the end. Then you have the Dancer and Cleric, which could be seen in the same way as the Warrior and Scholar, but for support, albeit a bit weaker. Both of these starting jobs contribute something useful to a team early in, as no other recruitable characters can replicate them. However, they are pretty limited on the support side of things, with some of their moves being pretty mediocre to bad. Even so, they can carve a niche that other jobs can't, which is useful in its own right. The Merchant comes after that, and despite having Arrow of Fortune JP grinding as a niche, I don't really think it makes up for the rest of the job. A lot of the job doesn't have a clear focus, and the loss of hired help really does hurt its offensive potential. It does get access to an amazing passive skill once you learn everything, but that's way later into the game, which is why I can't really recommend it over many of the other jobs. It can be a useful job, but it's not something you'll see early into the game. And last, the Apothecary, which I think you should avoid at all costs. Any of the unique traits it has doesn't make up for all its drawbacks, and the overlap from Stia and Macy make it even less of a worthwhile job to consider. It unfortunately doesn't do anything that substantial. That being said, what you choose in the beginning isn't what you're stuck with throughout the entire game. Once you learn enough moves from a job, you can swap over to another one of your choice. That said, if you're going to start with any job, I would highly recommend the Thief or the Hunter, as they're both incredibly strong jobs with a great deal of utility. But if those aren't up your alley, then you still have a decent amount of jobs to choose from that will put in some work regardless. I do think over the course of the game, some jobs will end up becoming stronger, but by that point, you shouldn't have many issues with JP anyway. But because of that, early game is going to matter a lot more, which is why I went with this order. But that's just my take on things. I'm really here just to help in any possible way I can, but maybe there's something you don't really agree with. Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know what your thoughts are down below, and make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.